What if you grew up in a belief system that told you everything around you was an illusion? What if you were told everything that happened to you, from being sick to stubbing a toe to being bullied at school, was your fault for not knowing the truth? What if you were denied even the most basic health care, from pain pills to checkups to vaccinations? How do you unravel yourself from this belief system? And what happens when you do? My name is Hillary Alexander, and this is Leaving Christian Science. Welcome to episode 10 of Leaving Christian Science. My guest today is Todd, who, once again, I met through the Ex-Christian Scientist Facebook group. And I just learned that Todd is speaking to me from Japan. So kind of my first international chat. Hi, Todd. How's it going?
Hi there. Nice to see you here
Yeah.
from sunny Japan.
Yeah.
It's going well.
So let's start with the usual starting place, which is, when did Christian Science enter your family's history? How far back does it go for you?
Yeah, from what I know, I'm at least third generation. I don't know anything about from before that. My father's parents started going to church. They just wanted a place to take their kids, and it seemed kind of non-offensive. But they kind of became disgusted with political and financial things about the church, I think around the 1980s, and stopped going.
Hmm.
And all my father's siblings also stopped going. He's the oldest, and he's the only one who stayed in. So they were not born into it. They came later in life. My mother's mother was a Christian Scientist, and I don't know about her parents. My maternal grandfather was not, and they just, that they had a sort of a life balance that allowed, that relationship to work.
Yeah, yeah. So were you in a radical reliance household? Did you see
Yes.
doctors?
Yeah, we did dentists, we did glasses, and that's about it.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so my father especially, he was second reader once. I think he was first reader twice, church board. He wrote a letter to the mother church, I believe, during the Bliss Nat book um, time period, expressing disagreement. And so as a practitioner, he was never journal listed because of that, but he was
Oh,
also
wow.
a practitioner.
So he was a practitioner.
Yeah.
Yeah. Did you go through class instruction?
I didn't. Sibling did.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So when you were growing up, do you consider yourself, were you all in? Or were you skeptical? What was your take on it as a young boy?
Yeah, that's hard. So I had a bunch of health problems as a kid. I constantly had colds,
Hmm.
bronchitis, coughs, um, eczema on my skin. And so, we'd call practitioners about coughs, and like, they'd tell me like, your cough is caused by your anger.
God.
And like that never really sat well with me, but it was like, what are you supposed to do, when you're like 8 years old and they're telling you this kind of stuff. I do remember bicycling into town one time to buy aloe vera gel for my eczema. It was like super contraband. I had to keep it hidden. Um, so I wouldn't say I was all in, but I did consider myself, a Christian Scientist. There was always, nagging doubts or whatever.
Yeah.
But that never, for a long time, that never equated to or resulted in like specific doubts about the religion, if that makes sense.
Hmm.
Mm.
Yeah. It's interesting how we can have these sort of nagging doubts, but at the same time, maybe it's just a child brain thing. Because I certainly had doubts, but like you, I never, somehow that never translated to questioning the validity of the actual religion.
Mm.
Like it never crossed my mind, well, maybe Christian Science just isn't true. That was never a thought until later.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And yeah, it must just be something from having been raised in it, and your parents are doing it and you trust your parents. You think they're smart. They
Mm.
tell you this is the best way to be. And you just don't question that until you get to that phase of life where you start questioning things that your parents told you, but you're
Yeah,
not typically doing at 8 or 9.
right,
That comes
exactly.
later. Yeah. So at what point did you start to pull away? Like, were there specific instances that happened, or was it a
Mm.
gradual process?
Um, yeah, it's a good question. So I went to Principia Upper School, which
Mm.
is, the high school for Christian Scientists. At that time, it was Christian Scientists only. Now it's not because population is dwindling. And then I went to a private college for a couple of years, and then Principia College for 1 year of my college time. Um, when I was at the upper school, I was pretty much still in, um, especially like I was a long distance runner, and it played a big part, on the sports teams there. Of course, the Christian Science way of thinking,
Mm.
and so it would be going through my mind as I was running, and of course you've got the runner's high and endorphins and all this stuff happening, kind of probably similar to what people in mega churches experience when you've got 10,000 people singing the same song or whatever. And that was a little bit weird. Like I remember thinking like, oh, this is like a really ego driven way to apply this way of thinking, but it was working, so okay. Because I felt good. um and like our coach would tell us funny stories about like the runner who crossed the finish line said, "Coach, I prayed while I was running and I felt so much better today." And the coach looked at his stopwatch and said, "Well, that's because you're a minute slower." The point being, it's not only prayer, you have to run too, as a way of sort of like a humble brag about the religion, right?
Yeah.
um so I don't know, like that was just a different perspective, but it didn't really sort of push me away. But I went to a private college. I started drinking with everybody and smoking just a little bit of marijuana, not much. um and like it was really weird. I do remember the first time I smoked marijuana, I literally thought I was going to wake up with dreadlocks. Seriously. I had a lot of hair at the time, but like I had no idea what was going to happen. Like I did not realize that like it affects you for a couple hours and then it's gone. Like um so that was weird that it wasn't like this massive identity changing thing.
Yeah.
And then like the two things sort of started to, exist at the same time. And that then affected, like how it affected how attached I was to Christian Science. Not how I thought about the religion. I didn't really wonder if it was true or not. I guess at that point, like, my mother had died because of lack of medical care,
Oh.
when I was in high school.
Mm.
Like, I had kind of given up on like the healing aspect of Christian Science, but it was still like a part of my philosophy. Um, and then when I moved to Japan for the first time after graduating college when I was 23, I started to become more interested in Buddhism, and like more as a like a course of study, like a cultural study rather than the religious aspect. But at the same time, was introduced like meditation, sort of as a part of a way of life. And at that point, I think like that was enough to sort of fill the hole where something spiritual had been.
Yeah.
And at that point, I really just let it go.
Yeah.
So I think at that point in my transition, like there was like a space there that needed to be filled. Um, but since then, I've become completely atheistic, and if there is that space there, it's filled by other things that are more actually present in the world.
Yeah. Yeah. I think I talked with Julie about how growing up, I always felt like having a spirituality was this really important element in your life. And it was this thing that you just couldn't live a complete, full
Mhm.
life without having this spiritual life. And whether that showed up as going to church or taking time to pray or just sort of having this part of you, this sort of private internal part of you that believed in things for which there was no evidence,
Mhm.
and that this was like a good and important thing to have. And it felt like if I didn't have that, there would be this massive hole and it would just be empty. And I didn't know what that was like. I was terrified to see what it would be like to not have this spiritual life, to not have this belief. And like I think the way Jody articulated it, especially, she said, I'm just going to try this on. I'm going to just take a day and see what it's like to not believe in God and just see what that feels like. And you come
Nice.
to realize that it doesn't feel like anything.
Yeah. Yeah.
You're still the same person you were when you believed in God. And the
Yeah.
same
Yeah.
things happen in your life that would have happened anyway. And you realize,
Yeah.
like, wait a minute.
You don't wake up with dreadlocks.
Yeah, you don't wake up this completely changed person. Yeah, I mean, there's such an intense phobia, and I don't think this is unique to Christian Science. Definitely not, but this intense phobia of what will happen to you if you stop believing.
Yeah.
Turns out nothing.
Yeah.
Nothing
Yeah.
happens.
Recently, I attended a presentation by, it was supposed to be a non-denominational presentation by some Christians about, the sort of this topic. And one of the things they mentioned in passing was, what happens after death. And they were comparing like religious views versus non-religious views. And for the religious views, it was like heaven, hell, something. And the non-religious view was annihilation. And I was like, you so don't understand what you're talking about.
No. Yeah, they just don't get it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm interested to know the emotional life of your childhood, because that's a
Mm.
big element of it. And, there's the medical part, which is pretty unique to us, but then there's the emotional part. I mean, do you feel like Christian Science's tendency to sort of deny, 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 and having to make you this happy person all the time? Do you feel like that was an expectation in your household?
I don't know about the happy part. I think we had a really cold household.
Yeah.
Um, no emotional discussion, not much emotional expression, not much fun or laughter. My sibling just remembers silence.
Mm,
I don't have such a memory of that, but I definitely I definitely believe that was the case. Um, yeah, we were definitely sort of doers. We played games, we read books. There wasn't a whole lot of being or understanding of being. Um, Looking back now, I went through, I mean, we can get to all of this in order, but I went through like a long period of sort of psychological study, like human psychology, narcissism, codependency, which is very active in Christian Science, um, and have recently looked more to like the recovery side of thing, like adult children of alcoholics and other dysfunctional families, which is a 12-step program, and other things along those lines. And yeah, come to realize that it was definitely, there was medical neglect, physical neglect, emotional neglect, in addition to like, this sort of religious abuse. Um, yeah, I think it affected me very deeply.
yeah, I think it's just a very common story that a lot of us were just really emotionally neglected and came from homes where big feelings or feelings at all just weren't acknowledged, weren't considered a good thing. You couldn't express yourself. You couldn't, you know, explain how you felt about something because everything's unreal and you just have to know the truth. And that's just incredibly damaging, you know.
Yeah, if you're having a bad emotion, it's your fault because you created that with your imperfect thinking. But if you're having a good emotion or feeling, well, that's God.
Yeah, you only get credit for the bad things.
Yeah,
All the good things, all the credit goes to God. Yeah, which is just so patently unfair.
yeah,
I mean, that thing of you being told that your anger was causing your coughs. I mean, I can't tell you how many times practitioners said things like that to me in this
yeah.
sort of weird Louise Hay kind of every illness is connected with some personality trait or some
Oh, yeah, no,
activity or
fear causes cancer.
yeah.
Yeah, weird.
Yeah, my mother would often make these odd little comments about people we knew that were sick or had suffered some sort of tragedy, and she would always sort of pick apart parts of their personality or something that they had done. And that's why, they got breast cancer is because they had an affair or and just this constant blaming and shaming and I mean it's
Yeah,
so cruel and
yeah,
so inhuman.
yeah, yeah. It's so, yeah, cruel and condescending, and yeah,
Yeah, holier than thou. I mean, I that was something I was accused of in school by other kids on occasion. They would use this term holier than thou, and I would get really offended. But looking back now, it's like, yeah, they were right. I mean, I
yeah,
definitely inherited that judgy, I'm always right kind of thing that happens with Christian Science and a lot of religions, that just feeling of like you're clued into this highest truth because you're so smart and nobody else has it, nobody else gets it because they're not as good as you are. And that's just a terrible way to go through the world.
Yeah. I escaped that in high school because I was, surrounded by a bunch of Christian Scientists. But when I went to the first private college, like I remember being called an asshole by a guy who I really offended, and
Mm.
right. So he could have called me a lot more at that time. Um, but I was like, what? I'm just saying. Yeah.
Yeah, you were just speaking the truth. What's wrong with that?
Yeah. Yeah. Sorry, guy.
Why
I
are
was
you
an asshole.
offended?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But
So
it is ironic because my father actually had like anger control issues. That was like his only real emotion other than normal. And it would build up and he'd explode. Um, and so it was just super ironic, being told that, my stuff was being caused by my anger, when, where did I get that?
yeah, exactly. And as a young boy, what are you supposed to do about it?
Yeah.
Are you supposed to just never be angry again? I mean, what's the solution?
Yeah. In order to protect my dad's fragile emotions, right?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, that's such a burden placed on young children to not only physically heal themselves, which is impossible, first of all, but to also deal with these so-called other issues that are causing the physical ailment. I mean, you don't have the capability of doing that, especially with no guidance from an adult or a therapist or a parent or something. I mean, that's one of the things that I think about so much is these little kids like you and me. I mean, my experience, and I imagine this was yours too, was very much this solitary experience of you just go off in a corner and fix this. Just read this
Yeah.
passage and you work it out for yourself. I mean, there were times when my mother would comfort me or whatever, or try to help or read along or sing a hymn or something like that. I wasn't constantly isolated. That's not true. But in the end, it was all your work. Like you had to just figure this thing out.
Yeah.
And that's an incredible burden on a child, you
Yeah.
know?
But yeah, no, and you just kind of alluded to this, like the only companionship or affirmation you'd get would be centered on CS, not your pain, not emotions, just you're doing the CS thing. And if you're having pain or emotions but not doing the CS thing, you don't get that affirmation from your parents.
Yeah, because they're only pleased when you're being a good Christian Scientist.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely figured out pretty young that performing Christian Science for my mother was very important, you know.
What did I just find online? I found, so there's the 4F reactions, right? Fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. Somebody wrote online that fawning is performative. What is it? Performative something. Performative cooperation.
Mm.
And I thought, wow, that's so much like practicing CSs as a child.
Yeah, well, I love that because I've heard of fawning, and I definitely the minute I found out that there was this other thing, fawning, I was like, oh, that's me. But
Mm-hmm.
yeah, performative cooperation, absolutely. But at the same time, like I use the word performative, but I wouldn't say I was faking it because it felt real to me.
Well, you have no other options. It's the
Yeah,
only thing you have. So
yeah. I mean, I wish I was one of these people that knew all along that CS was complete nonsense and was onto it and like left at 18 and just like was right there. But I I really thought it was real. I mean, I would sit down to pray and I would feel this like good feeling wash over me and I would feel very peaceful and I would feel God working through me and I would hear his voice. Of course it was me just talking to myself. But it felt very real. All of those positive, peaceful feelings that I would get when I would sit down to pray or when I would read the lesson. Like I understand now what that is, what chemicals were happening in my body and how I was breathing differently and I was relaxing and all of that is going to bring about a certain physiological reaction that I was experiencing. But to me, it was God. To me, it was this power, this intensity that was very, very real. So it didn't even dawn on me until I was well into my adulthood that there was even the possibility that God couldn't be real. It didn't even cross my mind, you know? It was like, well, yeah, of course I believe in God. That was always the attitude. It's like, well, no.
Right. Yeah. I think part of the the non-religious side of Christian Science was, acknowledging other religions. I'm like, oh well, they're doing their best, but it's not the right path, but it's a path, kind of thing. So yeah, the idea that God might not exist was not part of the conversation at all.
Yeah. 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 We were always the ones who had it the most right.
Mhm.
And they sort of, and even just using the word science, which, as we know, there's nothing scientific about this religion at all, but just using it makes it sound smart. And it's a term that you can use and feel good about, you know, saying I'm a Christian scientist. It
Right.
sounds very thoughtful and academic, but it's neither of those things,
Yeah.
as we now know.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So how was your family with your leaving? Like what was that process like with your relationships?
Yeah, it was weird. My dad always hated giving advice.
Hmm.
Um, Even when I specifically would ask him, he'd say something. I remember him saying at one point, "Well, I'd really hate to say anything that influenced your decision." It's like, no, that's what I'm asking you to do.
Yeah, oh, that's odd.
Yeah, it was really weird. So he just watched it from afar. He had nothing to say about it,
Hmm.
which I thought was a little strange. But I mean, he just got deeper and deeper into it. Up until he died, he really thought that he was going to have access to the power that people were demonstrating in their testimonies around the turn of last century, when all these I don't know I don't know what's in those testimonies, but raising people from the dead, or making limbs grow back, or whatever they did. He kept saying, his phrase was, "I want in on that." He kept repeating that, "I want in on that."
Hmm.
Really thought it was there to access. um but yeah, when I left, he didn't have a single thing to say about it.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, it brings to mind how much we stay in these belief systems for the people that we care about, you know.
Yeah.
I certainly I knew that my mother would find a way to not have me in her life if I ever was honest about
Mm.
not being a Christian Scientist anymore. And that's exactly what happened. I finally
Oh,
just couldn't lie to her anymore and had to say the actual words. I really don't believe in this anymore. And sure enough, within days she had completely cut me off and we pretty much never spoke again. I mean,
jeez.
that's how intense that was. But I faked it for quite a while and would sort of
Mm.
listen to her Christian Science talk and kind of nod along and
Mm.
pretend I was still right there with her because I was afraid of that. I was afraid
Mm.
of losing her, and I was correct in that fear. But yeah, especially
Wow.
between husbands and wives, and I can imagine there's a lot of staying in it for this other person
Hmm.
and probably never even really articulating it to yourself that you're not into it. You just sort of slowly stop reading the lesson and slowly stop thinking about it. And I think for most people when they leave this, it's not, for me it was a very like violent pushing out,
Yeah.
but I think for a lot of people it's not like that. It's just a kind of this slow melting away
Yeah.
of this old belief system that never really worked.
Yeah. Well, it's like, what they say about Jehovah's Witnesses. They go out on their missionary work, and the point is not to get other people to join the church. The point is that they go out, and the outer world, everybody's saying, no, go away. I don't want to talk to you. Then they go back inside their church, and everybody's welcoming and friendly. And that just cements their way of being. And it's like you were saying before, that holier than thou way of being in the world. Like you're not allowed to do that outside the Christian Science church. So, the outside world is constantly telling you, you're a little weird. So, you've got that safe space where everybody's, protected in their weird way of thinking and talking. And like that becomes the place where you belong.
Yeah, I've learned that recently about missionary work, or just going door to door in general, that its real purpose is not to get new people in. It's to reinforce the bonds of the people that are already in because everybody else is being cruel to you and slamming doors in your faces. And that was a real revelation to me. I was like, yeah, yeah, it reinforces this belief that the only safe space is with your group and the outside world is scary and stay in the group because this is where safety is. And
Yeah.
that gets to a very primal part of us as human beings. You know, we're
Oh
very
yeah.
related people and we want to be safe and we want to be with our tribe. And, you know, and that has a lot of negative sides to it, as we've seen.
Yeah.
I mean, I was lucky growing up that I didn't grow up in a Christian Science environment.
Mm.
You know, I didn't go to Principia. I didn't go to the schools. I did go to a camp, which I actually enjoyed. I had a great time at Christian Science camp, but I was also lucky enough to not have any accidents or illnesses while I was at a Christian Science camp, you know? So it was a positive experience because I got lucky. But that I say over and over again, that I feel like that's the thing that saved me was that most of the time I was surrounded by non-Christian scientists and especially other children. I never had kids that were my friends that were Christian scientists for the most part. So I was able to be in the world and in some way absorb a more normal way of thinking. And I'm sure it's somewhere in my brain, I must have understood, you know, these people don't have the truth, but they seem pretty happy, you know? So what am I doing? And I'm working so hard mentally all the time, fighting these forces and standing up against malpractice and all this nonsense. And I'm doing all this work, and yet we're both kind of in the same place. In fact, these people seem to be having a happier, more fun life than me. I'm sure there was some seed planted there, you know?
Mm. Yeah, yeah, I'd agree. I had a lot of non-CS friends, and there was no restriction on hanging out with them or anything like that. Yeah, I definitely always had a sense of like not being like them, not fitting in.
Hmm.
Yeah, that was I didn't enjoy elementary and junior high school. And I always look back at the upper school like wow, like it was so easy to be around everybody there. Of course, there was lots of people I didn't like, but that fit into the same framework as well, right? And it wasn't until I learned about like CPTSD and it's like, oh, like we're all traumatized in the same way. That's why it was so easy to be around each other.
Yeah, there was a moment where I think I was around 12 or 13 where I became interested in going to Daycroft, which was a Christian Science boarding school, I guess in Connecticut. Somebody was talking about it in the group the other day. And I don't know, it's hard to remember now what my thought process was. I honestly think it was because I was really into British culture and it seemed like going to boarding school was a very British thing to do. And I was 13, you know, I was that kind of kid. It's like, I want to do that British thing. Um, but I also, it definitely appealed to me the idea of being surrounded by Christian scientists, because other than camp, I had never had that experience. Um, and I suppose facing those teen years and not really knowing what that was going to look like was a little scary. And so I thought I would put myself in this safe place. But we went to tour it, and it turned out this was my impression, my mother's impression also, thankfully, that the kids there were just as like corrupt and misbehaving as kids anywhere else. Like the kids were sneaking off and smoking and doing all these like clandestine things. And I was like, well, this isn't what I thought it was going to be. I was going to come here and be this good little Christian Scientist. And it's just the same as like public high school in New York City. Like, what are we talking about? So, so I failed at my attempt to put myself in like this warm CS bubble. It wasn't
That's
what I thought it was going to be at all.
mm. Yeah, I preferred to go somewhere closer to home for high school, but I took a touring weekend or a visiting weekend at the upper school. And my parents said, well, we'd prefer that you go here. And my thought was, well, the school store is pretty cool. You can't ask a 13-year-old to make a decision like that.
Yeah, exactly. Their decisions are going to be made off of things like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
my kids now would be like, well, there's a Minecraft elective. I want to go to that school. It's like, well,
Yeah.
that's not a reason to go to a school.
Right. Right. But yeah, no, I got in all sorts of trouble at the upper school. I was always sneaking off, making campfires in the woods or whatever. They tried to kick me out one time.
Mm.
but it was fun.
So when you were in I'm curious of the what it was like day to day. Like, did you have to read your lesson? Or did they just sort of give you free time where you were supposed to read your lesson? Like, were there, was it
Mm.
regimented towards CS things?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. There was wake up announcements. You generally had to wake up at the same time. And then you had 30 minutes in the morning when you were supposed to read your lesson or other CS materials. Um, and then there were, you had to go to Wednesday night and Sunday morning services, either on or off campus. I guess that was about it. But I mean, it permeated everything, of course. Um, Not the academics so much, but definitely like sports and other activities. Um,
Yeah, how did it relate to the sports? I'm curious.
oh, just that, I mean, sports are always filled with, difficulties or injuries or things like that. So, you'd get tape over your blisters, but also the CS talk.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, it must have been an interesting dichotomy being an athlete in Christian Science because you're not supposed to be connected to your body, and yet you have to be to
Yeah.
do these things. So there must be a lot of cognitive dissonance there.
Yeah. It was just ignored. I mean, CS is, mm, it's basically just it's word salad, mental gymnastics, and you can make anything fit any way you want. And, that's why people like going there. I said to somebody recently, like, it's not the truth. It's not science, right? So everybody has their own individual understanding of what it is. Like, there are no two Christian scientists who think CS is this. They don't have the same image of what it is, right?
Mm.
Everybody has their own idea of what it is. But the atmosphere and the word salad and the mental gymnastics allows all of those people with their disparate understandings of the religion to exist and communicate together, right? So you can make anything fit.
Yeah. I mean, I always felt like everything was just so vague,
Mhm.
especially compared to other religions where they have very specific rules and very specific things that they believe.
Mhm.
I would try to explain it to people. Like I would always have these sort of comparison wars with other kids who were different denominations, and we'd get out our Bibles and something I'm not proud of that I did this, but we would always debate our religions with each other. And I would struggle to explain what Christian Science actually was and what we actually believe. When I was quite a bit younger, I would get into these relationships that were extremely controlling,
Mhm.
where it was basically like a relationship cult, where it just completely stripped me of my entire identity and self-worth. And I was really young. I mean, I was teenager or young 20s. I thankfully moved past that pretty quickly.
Yeah.
And a lot of young people and older people too have experiences like that, but I can't help but connect the dots of, how did my sort of brainwashed upbringing contribute to that dynamic, you
Oh,
know,
absolutely.
of
Yeah.
staying in and feeling like, well, I deserved it, and trying so hard to appease this person and fawning and all that stuff, just so that things
Yeah.
would be okay. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I absolutely, like when I started researching about narcissism to learn about my situation, narcissism and codependency, it's like interlocking pieces of the puzzle, right? Like I came to realize that basically everybody in CS exhibits both of those because you're constantly sort of allowing your thoughts to be policed by other people who are telling you, oh, well, your way of thinking about this is wrong, or you need to think this, but you're also doing that to other people as well. So, like, if you encounter, like I encountered a narcissist and allowed her to police my thoughts or tell me everything's my fault, but I wasn't able to do that back to her because she just sent it back to me.
Mm.
But I thought, well, maybe if I explain it better, she'll understand or something like that, right? Or not figure out how to get out, but figure out why that's happening and what to do about it.
Yeah. That's interesting, this thing of other people sort of policing your thoughts. I never really thought of it that way, but it takes me back to in junior high school, we read 1984. And something about it just completely sucked me in. And I
Mm.
became really fixated on this book to the point where I just read it over and over and over again. And I think probably what I was connecting to was this idea of your thoughts being controlled
Mm.
by this authoritarian power, this
Wow.
all-powerful totalitarian whatever.
Interesting.
Which in our case was probably could probably best be personified as just Mary Baker Eddy herself,
Yeah.
even though she's long gone.
Yeah. Well, yeah, everybody else in the church. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's one of the more tragic elements of the child cases that I noticed when I've read what actually happened with some of these children that died. So much of it is about the parents' social circle
Yeah.
and the coercion and the gaslighting that happens with these people who say things to them like, well, if you take this child into the doctor, it's going to be a tough road back.
Right.
You know, just the cruelty of these people shaming the parents for even thinking of getting their child medical care.
Yeah. Yeah. In so many cases, yeah, the parents were like they wanted to do something different and they were on the cusp of doing that, and then they were stopped. It's there's no words for it.
Yeah, there really are no words. I said in an earlier episode how when I was first really coming out of Christian Science and belief entirely, occasionally I would have those moments of maybe I'm wrong. You know, maybe Christian Science really is the thing. Maybe I'm just whatever. And I would make myself go read the child cases chapter of, I think it was God's Perfect Child. And every time I would be like, read this, be reminded of what this really is like. Because you're not thinking straight about it right now. You're getting too emotionally attached and you're not remembering what this really is and how dark it really gets. And every time I would come out of it like, yep, I'm out because this is what it is at its core is just people shaming each other,
Yeah.
you know?
So your road out was not so one directional or smooth.
Yeah, not really. I definitely had moments of doubt of thinking I should go back. But not big ones. It would just be these little tinges of, well, maybe. And then I would read the child cases and go right back. No, you're on the right path. It's okay. Don't worry. Yeah. But that was, I mean, that was later in life. I mean, I wasn't a teenager. That was well into my 30s that I was really just starting to make that transition of, okay, Christian Science is out of my life and letting go of God too was a huge part of that and very emotional and very traumatic.
Mm.
Um, you know, it felt like I had a friend tell me it felt like it's like losing your parents,
Mm.
which it was,
Mm.
losing
Yeah.
God, this all powerful, loving entity that looks out for our best interests all the time. You know, losing the belief of that was very emotionally traumatic for me.
Mm.
Yeah,
Yeah. Interesting. I had none of that.
that's good. I'm glad.
I remember when I first sort of put like my non-theism into like conscious thought. I read some books by Richard Dawkins.
Hmm.
And people have lots to say about him, oh, he's not for everybody, or, I don't like the way he talks, but I mean, he says what he says and, you can process it on your own. So like, I'd say don't throw that baby out with the bathwater. Right.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But, yeah, I was like, oh, okay, well, this is what I've been thinking without thinking it. This makes sense. And that
Yeah.
was it.
Yeah. I read a lot of those books by Dawkins and Hitchens and even Sam Harris. You know, I read a lot of books at the time about atheism and it just clicked. I mean, it was the first thing I read that really made sense for what I had observed in the world. You know, that things are random, that good things happen to bad people and bad things happen to good people, and there's no rhyme or reason to it. And this is it.
Yeah.
Because isn't every religion constantly trying to explain to people why do bad things happen to good people? You know,
Yeah.
whether it's karma or your thoughts did this to you or whatever. They're always trying to come up with a reason for something that really has no explanation, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah. Yeah.
And
I find it much more that where you don't have to explain everything or try and convince yourself about something of the afterlife or whatever. It's much more mentally relaxing.
yeah, yeah. I remember when my sister was still in for a couple of years before we kind of reunited in our atheism together. I remember her saying to me once, if I didn't believe that everything happened for a reason, I just wouldn't want to live,
Mm.
and there are a lot of people who feel that way.
Yeah.
Non-Christian scientists also who just it's such a source of comfort to feel like everything is happening by some design that's working towards the for good for you in some way. And that's such a comforting thought, but it's not comforting when you know that it's not true.
Yeah.
And you've
Yeah. Yeah.
seen that it's not true. Yeah,
Yeah.
one thing I learned recently about cults and religions is that they install a phobia. They install these phobias in you to keep you
Mm.
in of what'll
Mm.
happen if you're not in the group. You know,
Yeah.
like in a group like Nexium, they would say, "Well, you're just never going to deal with any of your shit. You're just never going to deal with
Yeah.
any of it, and that you're here to deal with your shit. And if you
Mhm.
leave, you're just going to be a failure." And that's
Yeah.
their phobia. And it's sort of like, well, I could see a therapist. That might help. There
Yeah.
are other
It,
options other than being a Nexium.
yeah. Well, it's not dissimilar. It's like, yeah, you need to stay in CS and allow us to police your thoughts and continue to police your own thoughts, or you're not going to have a community. Because you don't really fit in with the rest of the world.
Mm, yeah, it's amazing how the tactics are so similar throughout all of these groups. And when you educate yourself about it and you learn the things that people do consciously or unconsciously to control other people and to control groups, it gives you that ability to make an informed decision about the group that you're in. Say, well, wait a minute, am I really self-directed in this group or not?
Yeah. 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 Self-directed. That's a great metric, I guess.
Yeah.
So did your mother also cut ties with your sister?
Yeah.
Well, it's good that you have each other.
Yeah. Yeah. We talk about that often, how
Yeah.
glad we are that we weren't alone in that experience.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Because like many Christian scientists, some years later she died alone
Mm.
in an apartment and was found and had wrestled with some terrible undiagnosed illness for many, many years and was in a lot of pain. And she had a Christian Science death, you
Yeah.
know, that it's just so common for people in our age group because our parents tend to be elderly. This is what starts happening. It's all well and good until they get into their 60s and 70s. And then that's where the cracks start to show because it doesn't work. It
Yeah.
does not
Yeah.
work.
Yeah. No, I have an acquaintance who his mother is in probably stage 4 or 5 of what's probably breast or maybe lymphatic cancer and not acknowledging it. And his sister's still in CS and he doesn't know what to do. I was
Yeah.
lucky because my father was running the IT for Ardenwood, which is the Christian Science Care facility in San Francisco.
Hmm.
Um, and so he had cancer, probably melanoma that metastasized internally. And either it got into his brain or he had a stroke while he was out on a bicycle and ended up being picked up by an ambulance. And he didn't tell us this. I found out via this friend who I mentioned. Um, I don't remember if it was before or after he died. Um, but I was actually there for business, but I was staying in Ardenwood to see him. Um, and I noticed that he didn't seem to have full vision on the left side of his vision body. Um, so I called or I emailed his brothers and told them what was going on, and they came out to visit him right after I had left, and they noticed that he was shuffling a bit on the left side of his body.
Hmm.
So it was either a stroke or a tumor. And he moved. He moved from his room to the care wing of the facility, and that's where he died. And I think that was just really lucky all around. If you're gonna be radically reliant, it's the best way to go.
Yeah, it's unfortunate that for so many people it becomes this long, drawn out misery.
Yeah, that's how my mother went.
Mm.
She was at home with her parents taking care of her, but too little, too late, kind of thing.
And you were young, right? You were a
Yeah,
teenager
I
at
was
the
17,
time?
and I think that's why they sent us off to the upper school,
Oh, wow.
because it was easier for them logistically and whatever, if you want to call it emotionally, without us there. Really crappy thing to do to a kid, though.
Yeah. I mean, that sounds like something out of like the 1800s, you know? Just send the children away because they're inconvenient and you don't want them seeing the reality of what's happening, I guess. But do you
Yeah.
feel like you were allowed to grieve properly in Christian Science?
No, no,
Yeah.
no, no. The only nice thing about that experience was that on the day that my mother died, rather than having, rather than saying, hey, Todd, you need to call home, or having one of the house parents tell me, my father actually asked that my cross country coach come. He didn't live in the dorm, so he came from across campus to tell me, and he was, I don't know, it was nice that he was the one to tell me.
Yeah.
All the rest of the experience was really just mm, neglectful and shitty.
Yeah. If I could list like the top five things that I think Christian Science is terrible at, allowing for grief is definitely way up there.
Yeah, no, it absolutely is. And I mean, it makes it really hard then, because part of the recovery process is, recognizing what happened and allowing yourself to feel sad for what you didn't have. And like you might not have that belief system still in your thinking, but it's like, allowing, like, being in touch with those negative emotions, allowing yourself to have them. And then saying like, I deserved this and I didn't get this.
Mm,
That's really difficult.
yeah.
Right? Because it's like there's still that, like I don't think it's my fault that I didn't get it, but there's kind of this mm, uh how would you say, like mm, this sort of fake strength that you put on. Well, I'm okay. Oh, I didn't get a healing, but I'm okay. I'm perfect. Right. And I think that's like a characteristic, sorry, I'm noticing in myself. Like I don't think I'm perfect. I don't think I'm okay. But like it's hard to recognize what's on the other side of that, because I've just been okay for so long.
Yeah. I told this story earlier on here about how when my mother's mother died, my mother's mother was not a Christian Scientist, so she had a normal life and death. And she died when I was 15, and it was my first experience of death, which is a big deal for a kid. And I was really broken up, and my mother somehow shut all of her feelings off and told me that it wasn't real, that she hadn't really died, that death wasn't real. And but I never bought into that. The feelings were just too big. I couldn't have
Mhm.
pushed them down if I tried, you know. So I had this very prolonged, probably healthy mourning period of just being really, really sad and talking about it a lot. And my mother didn't do that, and I was always kind of curious how that was for her. I
Well,
think she was just more indoctrinated than I was, I guess.
yeah, yeah. Well, I'm jealous. Yeah, that's something I'm still learning.
Yeah, I mean, I'm so glad that we live in an era, the information era, really, where there's just so much information about mental health and so much therapy available to us if we seek it out,
Yeah.
which is the hard part. It's also not really affordable for Americans anyway.
Mhm.
um, but at least we have those resources, we have those tools. If you can't afford a therapist, honestly, you can go on TikTok and watch a bunch of therapy videos and you might learn a few things. I mean, I can't tell you how much I've learned just from podcasts about mental health and about cults and about religions and people leaving religions. And I listen to these things all of the time, and I learn something every day. I learn something
Mhm.
new about how these groups operate and why I am the way I am and why I do the things I do and why things happen the way they did. It's just so great to be able to help yourself and unravel what happened to us as Christian Scientists.
Yeah, I agree. I think comparing to other cults is a really easy way to start, especially with podcasts and things like that.
Mhm.
Um, for me, kind of the next step was finding recovery groups like adult children of alcoholics and other dysfunctional families. I think most of the people in the group I attend are adult children of alcoholics, but so many things in common. I mean, it, what we suffered very specific things that, even other adult children of religious trauma didn't suffer. But at the same time, even for like alcoholic or sexual abuse, um, many of the symptoms are just the same, which was really eye-opening for me and kind of calming in a way. There's also a group called Adult Survivors of Childhood Abuse.
Mm.
I mean, for anybody, still watching an hour in, I really recommend finding some of these groups. They're all different. Like I attend an adult children of childhood abuse group, and I really enjoy attending there. I really like everybody who's there. I attended a different meeting of the same ACE, ASCA, and it totally wasn't for me. Wasn't for me at all. So I mean, don't attend one meeting and think, oh, this isn't for me. Try a few. I understand a lot of people growing up in cults are very resistant to things like 12 step because it seems controlling. But like at the end of every meeting, uh, the leader, he says the same thing. He says, take the best and leave the rest, which to me is like the opposite of a cult. Right?
Yeah, you can make up your own mind about what's useful and what isn't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I absolutely recommend those communities.
Yeah, I love that you brought that up because support groups are so important. And that was actually a big part of my early pulling away when I was around 19 or 20. I knew that something was wrong with me and I just couldn't put my finger on it. And I worked, a friend of mine that worked at a video store where I was working at the time, who was very into therapy and recovery, and she was a recovering alcoholic. She said, you need to find a support group. And I was like, well, I'm not an alcoholic. My mother wasn't an alcoholic. And she was like, no, there are other groups that deal with other things. And I think it was that first seed of that didn't really blossom for another decade or so of starting to understand our unhealthy family dynamics, and later the relationship of how Christian Science was such a huge part of that. Um, yeah, I got so much out of those groups. I think I went for 1 or 2 years before I left New York City and just never really picked it up again. But going to CODA was great. I also considered going to Al-Anon meetings because I somebody had told me, you don't have to have like an alcoholic per se in your family to relate to what these people are saying. You'll be surprised at how similar the issues are. So yeah, there was a point at which I was looking up Al-Anon meetings and never actually went, but yeah, I can second that. That's a good place for ex-Christian Scientists to start.
Yeah, they're all online now, so yeah, you can find one that works for your time zone. Um, and that's really, I mentioned, well, we both mentioned that, the lack of grieving in CS. Like those groups for me are really like a doorway into the sadness, that everybody kind of carries from what happened to us as kids. Like that
Mhm.
was that was the first time I really felt like more accessible to that side of things. It's just when everybody's there together talking.
Yeah, and there's an odd freedom of telling strangers your story.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I've noticed that. It's just a lot easier to speak freely in a room full of strangers, especially when you know that they're most likely like-minded and have had
Mhm.
similar experiences, and in an environment like that where they're not allowed to talk back or judge or, you know, crosstalk as they call it.
Right.
They're not allowed to interrupt you in the middle of a sentence and say, well, what really happened there was.
Right.
You can just say whatever the hell you want and everybody just listens. And then
Yeah.
they move on to the next person. And that's a
Yeah.
very safe environment.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're not being judged, you're not being shut down, you're not being told to shut up, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A weird thing happened though in one. There was there was a woman attending, and like something about the way she looked, like I just immediately thought, I bet she's also XCS.
Hmm.
Just
Interesting.
something about like her physical appearance and demeanor. And so I'd always, when I brought up, anything specific about the past, I'd say, I was raised in a cult. But when she and I were in a breakout room together, I actually mentioned it by name and she jumped.
Oh,
So there's something about some XCS, like you can find them on the street if you look for them.
interesting. I wonder what
Yeah.
it was about her that just clued into you that
Yeah.
was her thing too. Yeah. So Todd, tell me, is there anything else you wanted to talk about? Any specific issues or memories or things before we wrap up?
Yeah. Let's see. Not in particular. I would be curious though what you learned in your Coda group, because like I said, being married to a narcissistic abuser and learning a lot about how narcissism and codependency interact and sort of draw each other until you learn to reject that pattern of being. Like, what did you find in Coda that related to CS?
Well, I think, I was so young. I was still a teenager when I started, and I really just didn't have any concept of anything at that point. I was still laboring under the delusion that my family was great and we had this great relationship and everything was wonderful. And yet I felt terrible and depressed all the time. And I think that's what my friend clued into when she said, you need to do something about this. And so I think in Coda, if I can remember now, it's been, decades, but I think it was the first time that I became aware of some unhealthy dynamics that we had had, mostly in the shutting down of feelings and being constantly denied and just not being allowed to be human as a child. Like, no, humanity was not allowed. And it never occurred to me that that was wrong. It just seemed normal to me that that was a perfectly normal way to be in a family, was to be constantly told how wrong your feelings were. So I think if I could remember, it would be somewhere along those lines,
Interesting.
that it was the thing that opened the door for me to really examine our family dynamics and look at it and say, yeah, that was not good. I was neglected. I was emotionally neglected. I was physically neglected quite a bit. That's a whole other story that kind of doesn't have anything to do with Christian Science, so I don't tend to talk about it. But my mother
Yeah.
abandoned me a lot. I was left to
Oh,
be raised by other people fairly
geez.
often. We moved
Mm,
around a lot. Those
mm,
things aren't really related to Christian Science. They definitely didn't help. But Christian Science related is more, um, when she was present and we were living as a family, that she wasn't a safe person. I couldn't go to her with my thoughts and feelings without being constantly shut down or criticized or told I was wrong, or, you know, and that's just leads to all kinds of problems. And a lot of people, I never encountered another Christian Scientist that I knew of in these groups, but people related. They really, really understood and got what I said. And they had similar stories of, you know, emotionally stunted parents who just couldn't deal with them and didn't know what to do. And it gave me a real feeling of fellowship for the first time. I'm not alone in this. And made me realize that there was something really, really wrong that needed to be addressed. Like, we were not this happy family that I thought we were.
yeah.
Yeah, it was like this cold bucket of water over my head. Like, oh my God.
Interesting.
I just couldn't see it, you know?
Yeah. It's nice that you had that experience so early. Mine was more, I got out when I was around 23, but it was only much later, when I guess it was before I identified my ex-wife's abuse. I was really depressed,
Mm.
probably a lot of it because of her, but also just feeling very listless in life. I'm like, what's going on? And so I started searching around on Google for like, why do I feel this way? And is it related to, Christian Science? And that's how I found the Facebook group. And that started like a 10-year process of like studying human psychology, which then recently led into recovery. So yeah, I mean, it's a long road, and I don't know, if you're just getting started, it's probably worse than you think.
Yeah. So I'll ask you the final two questions that I like to ask everybody. In your opinion, is Christian Science a cult?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, we've touched on a lot of things during this conversation, but yeah, I mean, it's safe inside, it's not safe outside. You can think this way, you can't think that way. It's absolutely a cult.
Yeah. And then, in your opinion, was Mary Baker Eddy a true believer, or was she a little bit of a con person?
I remember reading that question when you sent it to me, and the first thing that came to mind is my ex-wife. My ex-wife says things that aren't true, and the moment she says them, she believes them as if they were true.
Okay.
So in my mind, it's not exactly the right question. Probably mental illness, narcissism, high degree of, control over the people around her. She just came to think that, her shit smells like flowers. So in that sense, she was a true believer, but it was rooted in something different. Her belief wasn't in Christian Science. Her belief was in her own manipulations.
Yeah, the more I get answers to this question, the more it really solidifies for me that what you're saying, in that she most likely did have that personality where she believed her own lie, and there was a certain maliciousness to it, especially as it took off and money became involved and there were more people to manipulate, more adoring followers. Yeah, could see how it really started to take a left, but it probably didn't really start from a great place either.
Yeah.
You know, I had wanted to believe that she did have this incredible experience and wanted to share it with the world. I mean, that's certainly the narrative we were brought up with.
Yeah.
But I don't think any of that's true, actually.
No, in fact, she sued the city. She tried to sue the city for the icy patch on the sidewalk where she fell. So
yeah, and then never included that as the origin story in the first edition of Science and Health. It only came in later when it became necessary to have an origin story.
yeah.
Yeah. I've learned all of this from doing this podcast, so that's been very helpful.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. All right, Todd. Well, thank you so much for being a part of this. It was great talking to you.
Yeah, thanks for doing this.
Yeah, it's always interesting to hear. Everybody's story has so much value for me. I always learn something and see myself in everybody's experiences, which helps me. And hopefully the people listening too. I mean, that's what I wanted to do, is just create another place that people could go just to feel some community and some, to have those moments of clarity about maybe what they're struggling with. So yeah. So thanks for participating.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Leaving Christian Science. Disclaimer, I'm not an expert, I'm not a historian, I'm not a therapist, I'm just an ordinary, imperfect human who had the misfortune of being born into Christian Science. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the guests and do not necessarily represent those of the host. This podcast is for informational purposes only and is not intended to replace professional, medical, legal, or psychiatric advice.